This was a very ruthless dictatorship, very brutal also. We have seen scenes emerging out of Syria of prisons which were really hell on earth. The collapse comes so suddenly when nobody really is expecting it that it stuns everybody. Syria remains a divided country. So we don't know whether the civil war is going to come to an end or there will be a fresh round of bloodletting. There is a big question mark on how the situation in Syria will unfold from here on. Nobody really thought that we will see Western governments welcome a new regime in Syria which is affiliated to the al-Qaeda. If this destabilizes the Middle East, especially friendly countries and critical countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, then it has a direct impact on India's energy security. We should be studying how these guys operate. We should be studying their networks. We should be studying their financial patterns. For nearly 5 decades, the Assad family ruled over Syria with an iron hand. But like often happens with all dictatorships, and this was a very ruthless dictatorship, very brutal also. It had its redeeming features in terms of the social freedoms, the social policies of the government, the rights of women, the rights of minorities. But when it came to political rights, it very brutally cracked down, and we have seen scenes emerging out of Syria of prisons which were really hell on earth. And when this regime or this dynasty, if you can call it that, collapsed after 50 years, it actually collapsed like a deck of cards. And this is something which is extremely important because the collapse comes so suddenly when nobody really is expecting it that it stuns everybody. The guys who have taken over a radical Islamist organization called the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was earlier called the Jabhat al-Nusra and was affiliated with the al-Qaeda, and its leader Mohammed claims that he has severed his links with al-Qaeda. These are the people who have taken over, and this is a very radical Islamist group, although it is pretending or at least showcasing itself to be moderate and relatively progressive in a certain sense, and going to be very inclusive, accommodative of all communities. It's talking about building up a new Syria. But the fact of the matter remains that Syria remains a divided country. Although the HTS has defeated the regime, Assad regime, and has occupied the territories which were earlier under the control of the then government, there are large parts of the country which are in the hands of other rebel groups, the Kurds, for example. So we don't know whether the civil war is going to come to an end or there will be a fresh round of bloodletting as the HTS and its associates consolidate and then make a push for capturing the areas which are right now under the control of other rebel groups. So there is a big question mark on how the situation in Syria will unfold from here on. But apart from that, there is also the factor of how are these groups going to govern Syria. Will they govern in a more inclusive manner as they are claiming to be, or will they revert to the stereotype which is of a hardline Islamist regime which has very little tolerance for non-Muslims, minority groups within Islam. For example, the Alawite sect of Islam, the Shias and others in Syria. So there is a very big question mark on how that will unfold, and which is why very often people think, although it's being celebrated, Assad's ouster is being celebrated by many people, including by the West, and nobody really thought that we will see Western governments welcome a new regime in Syria which is affiliated to the Al-Qaeda. It's almost as if for the Europeans in particular, if you're wearing a nice suit and you come out well groomed and you give interviews to Western media organizations, then it means that you are an acceptable guy. Perhaps that is also a cue for somebody who is likely to come into power. For example, the New York Times, the standard bearer of progressive values and of democratic values, actually carried an op-ed piece by Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was then one of the most wanted men by the United States when they were in Afghanistan. And the New York Times carried an op-ed piece literally presenting him as an acceptable figure. And then later on we had Golani giving interviews to Western media organizations. But who thought that Al-Qaeda associates, affiliates, even if they claim they have severed their links, would be welcomed by Western governments? But that is what has started happening now. But the important thing is that I sometimes wonder whether, and I'm not a defender of Assad, I think he ran a pretty nasty regime, and nobody needs to shed any tears on his ouster. But the fact of the matter remains that sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And one wonders whether Golani and his ilk is going to be a devil who's going to be proved to be worse than the ones whom they have replaced. But what is extremely interesting is the staggering success of the HTS. Within something like a week, they came out of their bases in northwest Syria, and they just swept through the entire country. And the government, there was virtually no resistance. Not a shot was fired when they entered Damascus and captured it. There was some fighting when they were advancing towards Damascus, but that fighting was hardly anything to write home about. And the speed of the advance is quite stunning, really, which makes you wonder how quickly regimes collapse. Whether there were some side deals that Assad's generals had made, or that the army was so demoralized that it just simply melted away. I think a lot of information will come out in the coming weeks. But for now, it's just the sheer speed which is extremely interesting and has very striking resemblance to what happened in Afghanistan about 3 years back, when Kabul fell without a shot being fired. And at that point of time also, a lot of so-called Western academics, I don't know why people take them seriously anymore, had predicted that there will be stiff resistance, Kabul will not fall without a fight, and all that spiel was being given by Western journalists, academics, spy masters, policy makers. And yet, literally, the Afghan regime collapsed and the Taliban walked in, and even the Taliban were surprised by the speed of their advance. So one is that parallel that can be drawn with what happened in Afghanistan. The other is, of course, the fact that suddenly Golani seems to have been made very acceptable. Western governments seem to be welcoming what they call the return of stability in Syria. Whether it is the stability of the grave or it is actual stability, I think we'll find out. Now, quite like the Taliban before him, Golani has promised that it will be an inclusive government, women and minority rights will be protected, and that all the check boxes that matter to the West have been ticked by him, including the fact that his movement does not have an agenda beyond Syria. His movement is limited to Syria, something which the Taliban also promised. But we know that radical Islamist organizations do not necessarily stick to what they tell the rest of the world. The Taliban, for now, we must say, have not, at least insofar as India is concerned, there is no cause for complaint against the Taliban. But in the case of Syria, we don't know how this is going to play out, partly because it is entirely possible that the first focus of the Islamist regime in Syria is going to be consolidating itself. And I think if it has any agenda beyond Syria, that will only start manifesting after it has consolidated its own position within Syria. So maybe there is still some time before some of the other neighboring countries of Syria and the wider region need to start palpitating about what is happening in Syria and the destabilization this could bring in the region. Maybe there is still some time, but one could be wrong, simply because Golani, while being the leader, runs an organization which is also an amalgam of a number of other organizations. And even his own supporters within his own organization have an Islamist agenda which goes beyond Syria. Already we've seen footages of commanders of the HTS and its affiliated groups say that they are now going to go for Jerusalem, which means they are going to be attacking Israel. There are serious concerns growing in the Middle East among countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab states of the fallout of what is happening in Syria. Some of these countries share their borders with Syria, but other countries feel that when a group like this takes over power, it has an influence, even if it is not doing it directly. It does have an influence on radical groups around the world, around the Muslim world in particular, and they find inspiration from these characters. They find they aspire to emulate them. They are emboldened by the success of groups like this, and that then has an impact on societies and countries beyond Syria. So we'll have to wait and see how that factor unfolds. For now, what we are seeing is that the big losers seem to be Iran and Russia. Probably the Russian bases in Syria are going to be history. We don't know how that's going to play out. The HTS seems to have taken over both the areas of Tartus and Latakia. The Russian bases are there. Whether this will have an impact on the Russian presence, I think it will. I don't see how they're going to allow the Russian bases to continue indefinitely. Iran also will feel the heat because these are Sunni extremist groups, very hardline, no love lost for Shias. Maybe like the Taliban, they will not directly attack the Shias within Syria, but I don't see how they are going to countenance any interference from Iran, which was already happening in Syria. Iran and its affiliated groups like para-state groups like Hezbollah, which were providing a lot of support to the Assad regime, will not be allowed in. In any case, Hezbollah has suffered grievously at the hands of Israel and probably is not in a position to send its fighters in other parts of the Middle East to wage proxy wars out there, and will be more focused upon consolidating its own position in Lebanon, where some kind of a ceasefire has been struck. And for now, it seems that Israel is pretty well placed. I think Israel has probably done the right thing by going and attacking the strategic targets inside Syria, air bases and weapons manufacturing facilities, and perhaps a lot of the world can breathe easier, because Syria was supposed to have chemical weapons manufacturing capabilities, and if those have been destroyed by Israel, I think it gives us some breathing space. The problem, however, is that those facilities can always be rebuilt, and if you have a radical Islamist group in command, which is now running the state, and you have many of the engineers and scientists who were involved in building up of these WMD facilities in Syria, I think it's only a matter of time before somebody will want to tap into their talents and get hold of these weapons, and then all bets are off. And I think that is something that should seriously concern, especially the people in Europe and other places who are right now celebrating the ouster of Assad and welcoming whatever is happening in Syria. This could backfire on them very, very badly. Then there is, of course, the issue of refugees emanating out of Syria, and Europe will certainly be very concerned about it. For now, what we are hearing is that because the Assad regime has fallen, many of the asylum claims are not going to be entertained. But will they be able to deport many of the people who had been given asylum? Will people want to return to Syria? I have serious doubts about that. Will there be a new stream of refugees? It is quite possible, depending on how the situation unfolds within Syria. From an Indian point of view, I think what has happened in Syria is extremely critical, because if this destabilizes the Middle East, especially friendly countries and critical countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, then it has a direct impact on India's energy security. It has an impact on Indians the Indian diaspora, which is working in some of these countries. And so India has a direct stake in the stability of the Middle East. I don't know if the government of India is planning to do something about it, but I'm sure there would be a lot of brainstorming on what the fallback options for India are likely to be if the unrest in the Middle East spreads beyond what it is. The second impact is, of course, what will also impact Islamic societies or Muslim societies and countries will also have an impact in India. We already saw that when the ISIS, which was based essentially in Syria, had its headquarters in the Syrian city of Raqqa, had an influence globally, including in India. And we see a presence of the ISIS in Afghanistan even today. We see ISIS cells being found out in India. And if you have a group like HTS taking over power, then what is the kind of impact it will have both at a psychological level, at an inspirational level, on some of the people influenced by radical Islamist ideology within India. So that is going to be another matter of serious concern. A third matter of concern is going to be that, for example, the Taliban have welcomed the victory of the HTS, and how does this play out within the region? The TTP, for example, seems to be rather enthused by the HTS victory, and the TTP is already engaged in a struggle against the regime in Pakistan, which you can in some ways call Assad light, in terms of its brutality, in terms of its unpopularity, in terms of the fact that it has grabbed power. It's an illegitimate government which is in power in Islamabad, backed by a military which is increasingly unpopular, and the TTP is playing that factor to the hilt, and will they start getting some kind of support in terms of tactics, in terms of in terms of training, in terms of some of the weaponry that was used by people in the HTS, and that to be used against the Pakistani army is something that we in India will need to watch out for. Because it's not just about Pakistan, it is also about radicalism in Bangladesh and radical groups in Bangladesh. It is also about what is happening in Myanmar, which becomes extremely critical for us, especially because there is the Rohingya factor in Myanmar, which is kind of out of control, given that the country itself is spiraling out of control. So I think what has happened in Syria is not going to remain limited to Syria. Anybody who is celebrating right now might be doing it a little too much in advance. It's rather premature, these celebrations. Perhaps the HTS will actually live up to all the promises it has made, the assurances it has given out to the world. Perhaps it will live up to that. But I would, if I was a betting man, I would bet against it, because the nature of the beast is such that there is a certain logic to the kind of steps they are going to take the moment they are in power and they've consolidated their power. So I think we would be remiss if we do not look at what is happening in Syria. We do not study the tactics of these terror groups and these para-state organizations, which then suddenly sweep into power. The fact that we now have two states in India's near abroad, if we can call it that, in Afghanistan and in Syria, which are run by extremely radical Islamist groups. And I think that should be a matter of very serious concern to Indian security agencies. We should be studying how these guys operate. We should be studying their networks. We should be studying their financial patterns, how they get their finances, their recruitment patterns, their training, their tactics, the kind of weapons they use, the kind of improvisations they make in weapons. I think these are matters of very, very serious concern that we should be studying very, very closely, because somewhere along the line, maybe in a few years, maybe a little later, maybe sooner, this kind of stuff is going to start happening. Not just, it's already happening in our neighborhood, but it could start happening within India. So I think that is what should serve as a wake-up call for India, and we cannot afford to ignore what is happening in Syria.